Dawn crawled across the broken face of Saipan like a wounded animal, slow, trembling, hesitant. Smoke drifted in thin ribbons over the jagged volcanic cliffs, carrying with it the metallic scent of spent shells and the faint sweetness of crushed tropical leaves. The Pacific surf roared against the rocks below, a steady, indifferent drumbeat that made the island feel older than the war consuming it. And through this haze of rising light, a U.S. Marine moved carefully toward the mouth of a cave, his rifle lowered, his boots scraping against stone, littered with fragments of shattered coral. He held a makeshift white flag-a-torn bedsheet, tied to a splintered stick, because it was the only language. He hoped the people inside would trust. From within the darkness came a whisper. Then another. A sequence of trembling breaths, quick and sharp, like a small animal trapped beneath debris. The Marine, barely older than 21, shifted his weight and spoke in a soft, rehearsed tone. "It's all right. We're not here to hurt you." He'd said the line so many times over the past 2 days that it felt like part of his training, though it had never been written in any manual. Orders told him to secure caves. Reality demanded that he talk people out of them. The whispers turned into a scuffle of feet. A pair of narrow, dirt-stained hands emerged first. Then a young woman, thin, exhausted, no older than 22, stepped into the light. She squinted hard, as though the sun itself were enemy fire. Her clothes were torn, her knees bruised, and her hair bound with a strip of cloth that used to be white but had turned the color of sand. In one hand, she clutched a bundle wrapped in a child's blanket. In the other, she held nothing but air, as if preparing to raise her arms in surrender. Behind her, 2 more women appeared, followed by an older man limping and leaning on a wooden stick. Their faces were taut with fear, and their posture was rigid, as if bracing for some inevitable blow. The Marine lowered the flag and gently extended a canteen. At first, the young woman flinched, recoiling like she'd been struck, but then her eyes locked onto the shining drops beating along the metal rim. The thirst in her bones was stronger than the fear beaten into her mind. Slowly, painfully, she reached out, took the canteen with both hands, and drank. Her throat convulsed as the water slid down, and when she finally pulled the canteen away, her breath shuddered with disbelief. "They told us Americans would kill us," she said in halting Japanese, her voice gravelly from dehydration. "They said you would torture us." The Marine didn't understand the words fully, but he understood the tone, a mixture of terror, confusion, and astonishment. He gestured again, urging the rest of the civilians out into the light. One of the women carried a boy, no older than 5. His small face was ghostly pale, his lips cracked, his limbs limp from starvation. The Marine radioed for corpsmen, using clipped, controlled phrases. But even as he did, his eyes returned to the first young woman, who watched him the way one might watch a wildfire, fearful of destruction, yet mesmerized by the unexpected warmth. Inside the cave, the air had smelled of damp earth, stale breath, and desperation. For days, maybe weeks, the civilians had huddled there, trapped by rumors that Americans would slice them apart or bury them alive. These were not simple fears. They were propaganda hammered relentlessly into their ears by officers who preferred death over surrender. Leaflets and broadcasts insisted that capture meant horror. Better to leap from a cliff than fall into enemy hands. The young woman had believed those warnings so fiercely that she had kept a grenade near her chest, prepared to pull the pin if Americans found her. Now, standing beneath the morning sun, she wondered how so many lies had ever made sense. She lifted her eyes again, studying the Marine who had offered water instead of violence. His face was drawn from exhaustion, streaked with dirt and sweat, but his expression was open, almost gentle. And something inside her shifted, like a stone being lifted from her chest. Without warning, without thinking, she stepped closer. Her voice was barely more than a breath when she spoke. "Will you be my husband?" The Marine blinked. He froze so completely that even the wind seemed to pause in confusion. He glanced at his fellow Marines for help, but they were as stunned as he was. Marriage? Now? On a battlefield where mortar still echoed in the distance? It was absurd, yet the woman's eyes held no humor, no flirtation. Only fear and desperate gratitude. She believed marriage meant protection. She believed the man who saved her life could save her future too. And she believed that asking now before she was taken somewhere, before he disappeared into the war again, was the only chance she had to secure safety. The Marine tried to respond with kindness rather than rejection. He placed a hand over his heart, shook his head gently, and said a slow, apologetic no. But he smiled softly, reassuringly, hoping she understood it wasn't cruelty, but impossibility. Regulations forbade such things. The war forbade such things. Life itself, at this moment, forbade such things. Yet the woman nodded, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment and relief. She hadn't expected him to say yes. She'd only needed to ask, to anchor herself to something human in a world fractured by violence. Behind her, the other women exchanged small glances that suggested they too had considered similar pleas. When a world collapses, even improbable hopes can feel like lifelines. A corpsman finally arrived, kneeling to examine the child. He spoke softly, making slow gestures to show he meant no harm. But the boy's mother stiffened at his approach, clutching her son tightly until the Marine who rescued her stepped forward. Only then did she reluctantly release her grip. Trust, on this island, was a fragile currency dot as the civilians were guided toward a safer area. The young woman walked beside the Marine, her posture straighter now, as if the weight on her shoulders had lifted. She whispered questions in broken English. Where will we go? Will we be fed? Are we prisoners? He answered as best he could. You're safe. You'll get food. You're not prisoners. You'll be taken care of. Behind them, the cave loomed like a dark scar on the cliffside. Inside lay the remnants of panic-discarded rations, makeshift bedding, a grenade abandoned in the dirt. The lies that had imprisoned them were still echoing in the hollow chamber. But the people who had believed them were stepping into a future they had never expected to survive long enough to see. The sun continued to rise, revealing more Marines approaching from the beach, more civilians emerging from hidden crevices, more stories unfolding in the tension between fear and compassion. The young woman glanced back only once, watching the shadows retreat from the cave entrance. Then she looked forward toward the field hospital tents fluttering in the distance, her eyes reflecting an emotion she hadn't dared feel in years, cautious hope. But as they neared the clearing, a distant explosion rippled across the island, deep, resonant, unmistakably close. The Marines tensed immediately, scanning the horizon. The civilians froze. And in that suspended moment, the young woman realized the truth. The kindness she'd found in a stranger's hands did not mean the danger had passed. Something darker, something unforeseen, still waited beyond the ridge, and whatever came next would test the fragile trust she had just begun to build. The explosion rolled across the clearing like a warning from the island itself, shaking dust from the palm fronds and sending birds scattering into the sky. Instinctively, the Marines dropped to a knee, rifles rising, eyes sweeping the tree line. The civilians froze as though carved from stone. But when no second blast followed, the tension bled from the moment, leaving behind only the uneasy thrum of a battlefield that refused to rest. The rescued young woman, who had asked the Marine to be her husband only an hour earlier, stood close enough to touch his sleeve, uncertain whether to step forward or retreat. She watched his steady breath, the practiced calm in his movements, and realized he seemed almost comfortable amid danger. To her, this bordered on supernatural. The Marines resumed guiding the civilians toward the temporary holding area, a patch of cleared ground framed by makeshift tents in coils of concertina wire glinting in the sun. Corpsmen formed triage lines, while engineers fashioned shade from torn parachutes. It was crude, noisy, and dusty, yet for the civilians stumbling forward, it felt like the threshold of another world, one where fear did not dictate every heartbeat. A little boy clung to the Marine's trousers, his fingers tightening every time a gunshot cracked in the distance. The Marine bent slightly and offered the child a stick of chewing gum, demonstrating how to unwrap it with slow, exaggerated motions. The child hesitated, but mimicked the movements, his thin face stretching into a shy, uncertain smile. The young woman watched this with an expression that hovered between wonder and disbelief. She had been taught Americans were monsters. Yet here was one teaching a child how to chew gum, as though this were nothing more than an afternoon stroll in a peaceful village. Corman approached with water and powdered milk for the children. He knelt carefully, keeping his hands visible to show he meant no harm. His voice carried a soft Midwestern drawl as he urged the women to drink first. The older man who had limped from the cave blinked in confusion. Japanese officers had insisted that American soldiers would shoot men on sight. Instead, this American was tightening a bandage around his leg with the patience of a doctor treating a neighbor. That the women observed every gesture, their eyes tracking each Marine with wary fascination. Some covered their mouths when they laughed at the Marine's clumsy attempts at Japanese greetings. One woman broke into tears when offered a fresh blanket, as if the simple act of kindness carried more weight than the violence she'd endured. The young woman who had made the marriage proposal remained unusually quiet, but her silence was not fear, it was study. She watched how the Marines spoke to one another with casual humor, how they handed out rations with an almost brotherly protectiveness, how they touched no civilian without first gaining permission. Every observation added another stroke to the portrait forming in her mind. The enemy she had feared all her life did not resemble the man now offering her food. The Marine she followed broad-shouldered, sunburned, a little awkward, checked her for injuries with a medic's direction. She shook her head, insisting she was fine, though her trembling hands betrayed exhaustion. He opened a small tin of field rations and removed a square of chocolate. When he held it out to her, she stared at it as though he'd produced a gem from thin air. Chocolate had been a rare luxury, even before the war. She accepted it carefully, turning it over in her fingers before tasting it. The sweetness hit her tongue like a revelation. She looked up, tears rising, and bowed her head with a sincerity that pulled at him more than any plea for marriage had. Around them, the Marines treated civilians with a tenderness not recorded in tactical reports, but witnessed in countless testimonies. One Marine carried an elderly woman in his arms across the clearing, murmuring reassurance. Another removed his helmet and placed it on a child's head, prompting a brief chorus of laughter. These were small, human gestures, yet they were monumental to people who had lived under weeks of terror. The contrast between expectation and reality was so vast it felt surreal, but not all fears dissolved instantly. Some civilians flinched whenever a Marine shouted commands to another across the camp. Others refused to sit with their backs exposed. When a supply truck backfired, half the group dropped to their knees, covering their heads. The Marines responded by slowing their movements, lowering their voices, and signaling intentions before acting. This mutual learning became an unspoken language, one founded not on grammar or vocabulary, but on patience and empathy. As the sun climbed higher, the young woman began to understand the strange gravity pulling her toward the Marine who had saved her. It was not romance. It was safety made flesh. In a war that had swallowed her home, her family, and her certainty, he represented the first solid ground she had stepped on in months. He was the first person who looked at her without suspicion or command. Even without shared language, she sensed honesty in the way he met her gaze, reassurance in the way he stood between her and the horizon where artillery echoed. Yet another faint blast sounded in the distance, and the Marine's expression tightened. He turned to his comrades, exchanging brief gestures that spoke volumes. The front line was shifting again, inching closer. The civilians would need to be relocated to a more secure area, and the Marines escorting them would soon be reassigned. The young woman sensed this change even before he explained it through halting words and gestures. She saw it in the set of his shoulders, the way he scanned the terrain as though memorizing it. War was tugging him away. A shadow passed over her face, though the sun still shone brightly. She felt suddenly aware of how temporary this refuge was. The kindness she had discovered might vanish as quickly as it appeared. The Marine tried to reassure her with a nod, but even he couldn't mask the uncertainty. His orders, whatever they were, would come soon. And when they came, she feared she would lose the only person who had proved the world was not solely built of cruelty. As a jeep sped toward the camp, with a plume of dust trailing behind it. The Marine rose to his feet. The officer inside shouted for all unit leaders to assemble immediately. The Marine gave the young woman a final, reassuring smile, but his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than before, as if he, too, felt the fragile thread between them tightening. The island was speaking again, and what it whispered this time was unmistakable. Nothing about this fragile peace would last. Night pressed against the island like a heavy, suffocating cloth. The battlefield sounds softened, but never disappeared. Sporadic gunfire, distant mortar thumps, the lonely rattle of metal as Marines shifted in their foxholes. Lanterns flickered inside the civilian holding area, casting soft halos over the rows of exhausted, hollow-eyed survivors. The young woman sat among them, knees drawn to her chest, the blanket she'd been given wrapped tightly around her shoulders. But her gaze kept drifting toward the Marine who had saved her, who now stood at the far edge of the camp, receiving hurried instructions from a sergeant. She couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the tension. His unit was moving. Just hours earlier, she had begun to feel something dangerous, something she hadn't allowed herself since the war began. Stability, safety, a sense that tomorrow might exist. But the way he stood now, stiff with the weight of new orders, made it clear that tomorrow might come without him. She rose slowly, almost unwillingly, and approached the fence line where he paced in silence, waiting for the sergeant to return. He noticed her in the corner of his vision and offered a small, warm smile. She felt it like a hand on her heart. She bowed habit, culture, gratitude, and hesitated before stepping closer. He gestured for her to join him, keeping his posture open, palms visible, as though inviting a frightened bird to perch within reach. "Orders," he said softly, tapping his helmet for emphasis. "We move soon." She understood enough. She'd learned to read the shape of his words, the cadence of his voice. Her hands tightened around the blanket. "Where?" she asked. He pointed toward the inland hills, now a dark silhouette against the star-strewn sky. "Fighting up there. We go." The word struck her like cold wind. She looked toward the hills, imagining the explosions that would soon loom there. She wanted to ask him not to go, to beg him to stay, but she sensed such requests belonged to another life, one she did not possess. So instead, she said, "Danger?" He let out a breath, half a laugh, half a sigh. Always danger. But then he reached out and lightly touched her shoulder, an act so instinctively kind it made her chest tighten. "You safe here." She wished she believed that. But nothing on this island felt safe. Not the caves, not the cliffs, not the shelters filled with strangers. Safety, for reasons she struggled to explain, had begun to look like a single man with tired eyes and steady hands. Before she could speak again, a Marine runner approached, breathless and urgent. "We move in 10. He barked. Her Marine nodded, slung his rifle, and straightened. Then he turned back to her, searching her face as though memorizing every detail before he vanished into the night. She bowed again, deeper this time. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't understand the words perfectly, but he felt their weight. He lifted his hand in a gentle farewell, then jogged off toward his squad. As he disappeared between the tents, she realized he hadn't told her goodbye. Not properly. Not finally. A troubling hope sparked within her, one that whispered he intended to return. The civilians were moved to a secondary camp at dawn, escorted by corpsmen and military police. The path wound through scorched farmland and abandoned huts, past craters where entire families had once lived. The young woman walked carefully, avoiding debris that had once been household items. A cooking pot dented by shrapnel, a child's sandal, a fragment of a kimono. Each object was a reminder that survival did not guarantee peace. At the new camp, the atmosphere was tense. News spread quickly that some civilians had taken their own lives during the night, leaping from Sapan's cliffs in fear of American capture. A corpsman told her in whispered Japanese, gently but firmly, that she was safe now. But the truth lingered like a bruise. Not everyone believed safety was possible. She wandered through the camp, offering quiet comfort to the two women who had accompanied her out of the cave. One confessed she had dreamed all night of the Marine who carried her child. Another said she feared the remaining Japanese soldiers would punish her for surrendering. Even in a place meant for refuge, fear moved like a shadow between the tents. And then, late that afternoon, a stretcher arrived. 2 Marines carried it in silence, their faces carved from stone. A small group gathered as the corpsmen rushed forward. The young woman felt her heart jerk violently when she recognized something familiar, the same unit insignia her Marine wore. She pushed through the crowd despite whispered protests. The man on the stretcher wasn't him, but it was someone who had marched beside him earlier that morning. His uniform was torn and blackened by smoke, his leg bandaged tightly. His eyes flicked open briefly, searching the faces around him. When they landed on the young woman, confusion softened into recognition. He tried to speak, but winced instead. The corpsman leaned in and translated what little he could understand. Ambush? Hill Road, we lost some. Her stomach twisted. Lost? She repeated. The corpsman nodded gravely. She stepped back, her vision blurring as the world tilted. She clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders and whispered a prayer. The sun crested the horizon with a muted gold glow. A column of Marines trudged down the road toward the camp. Their uniforms were torn, their faces gaunt, but they were alive. She scanned them with desperate precision, her breath lodged in her throat. For a terrible moment, she saw only strangers. Then, behind a mule-drawn cart, he appeared walking with a limp, helmet tucked under his arm, dust clinging to his clothes. He looked older than she remembered, as though the hills had carved years into him. Yet when his eyes met hers, recognition sparked like the flare of a struck match. She rushed forward until the guard stepped aside, moved not by orders, but by the unspoken gravity of the moment. The Marine froze, startled, then smiled. A quiet, weary smile that said he'd fought death and returned with just enough strength for this single moment. She bowed deeply, and he lifted her gently by the shoulders, unsure of what gesture fit the occasion. She whispered something soft and trembling, and though he understood few of the words, he understood everything she meant. But the war's end brought new realities. Civilians were being registered, sorted, questioned, and prepared for repatriation. The Marine had orders to rotate with his unit to another sector. Their reunion, precious as it was, came with a countdown neither could stop. They met briefly over the next few days, small conversations, under the shade of broken palm trees, shared food, exchanged glances heavy with unspoken truths. She told him, through the help of an interpreter, that she no longer wished to marry him. Not because she regretted the question, but because she now understood the weight of the world he carried. What she sought that day in the cave was safety. What she felt now was gratitude. Still, something lingered between them, a bond made not of romance, but of survival, of trust, of the strange tenderness born only from war. When the day came for his departure, she stood among the civilians lined behind the wire, clutching the blanket he had given her on the first day they met. He passed by with his pack slung over his shoulder, boots scuffing the dirt. For a moment, he broke formation and walked to her, ignoring the raised brow of a lieutenant. He pressed a small object into her hands, a folded piece of paper with a few English words written carefully, the ink smudged. She opened it after he stepped away. "Be strong," it read. "Live well." She held the paper to her chest as the Marines disappeared beyond the bend. She never saw him again. Years passed. Japan emerged from the ashes slowly, painfully. Cities rebuilt themselves like living organisms learning to breathe again. The young woman returned to the mainland, carrying with her a memory she rarely spoke aloud, with trembling lips. She hadn't known the Marine long just hours. Really, but the bond formed under the threat of death had grown roots far deeper than time could measure. The sky turned orange as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the camp. The young woman walked to the perimeter fence and stared toward the inland ridge. Smoke still rose in lazy columns. She didn't know whether he was alive or dead, marching forward or lying somewhere unseen beneath the trees. But she felt the ache of his absence like a phantom wound. She waited there into the evening, long after the other civilians had retreated to their tents. The guards did not chase her away. They seemed to understand that war demanded its own ritual, so waiting among them just as night reclaimed the island. Footsteps approached behind her. She stiffened, fearing bad news. Instead, a soft voice spoke. "You looking for your Marine?" It was a young interpreter, a Nisei soldier from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, fluent in Japanese and weary from days of translating grief. She nodded silently. He sighed and rested his arms on the fence. They took heavy fire. Some came back. Some didn't. He paused. If he lives, he'll return when they rotate. If he doesn't. He didn't finish. She closed her eyes, tears spilling freely now. The interpreter hesitated before adding, "Sometimes, kindness is the first thing war takes away. But sometimes, it's the one thing it leaves behind." She breathed shakily, absorbing his words. She had survived bombs, starvation, propaganda, and despair. But the fear she felt now, fear of losing the one person who had shown her gentleness, was sharper than any she had known before. The interpreter touched her shoulder lightly. "Rest. Tomorrow may bring answers." She nodded, though she knew sleep would not come easily. As she turned to leave, a final explosion echoed from the hills below. Rumbling detonation that rolled across the island like a reminder that destiny was still being written in fire. She paused, staring at the dark horizon. Whatever happened on that ridge, whatever fate the war decided for the Marine who had saved her, she sensed that the next sunrise would bring news she was not ready to hear. The final weeks of the war passed like a fever dream, too hot, too loud, too painful to fully recall. Yet when the guns finally fell silent and the island smoke thinned into a pale blue haze, the young woman remained at the edge of the civilian camp each dusk, watching the ridge where the Marines had vanished. Each evening she convinced herself she heard footsteps returning, voices approaching, a familiar laugh carried on the wind. And each evening, disappointment settled over her like evening dew quiet. Inevitable, cold, but one morning, just as life demanded new identities, new futures, she married a local craftsman, raised children, taught them to read, taught them that fear was a prison, the world sometimes built around innocent hearts. But when she tucked her children into bed each night, she remembered the Marine kneeling to give a starving child chewing gum, the way he had tried not to frighten her, even when he himself was scared. She remembered how he had shown her a version of humanity she didn't know existed. She kept the paper he gave her in a small wooden box beneath her kimono chest. Over decades the ink faded, but the meaning did not. It remained a reminder of the day she discovered the world could be larger, kinder, more complicated than the lessons she'd been taught. Other survivors from Saipan carried similar stories. Some kept ration tins, others hid away American blankets or candy wrappers as though they were charms. They whispered to their children about Marines who carried wounded civilians on their backs or shared their only water. They described a strange contradiction: soldiers who fought fiercely yet treated civilians with bewildering gentleness. These stories rarely made it into official histories. They survived instead through quiet testimony, through the simple honesty of those who had lived them. Decades later, when she was old and her hair had turned the color of winter frost, she visited a small museum exhibit dedicated to the Pacific War. Behind a glass case lay relics gathered from Saipan, rusted helmets, fragments of radios, faded photographs of Marines handing out food. One picture stopped her breath, a Marine kneeling beside a young woman, offering her a canteen. The woman in the photo was not her, but the gesture was the same. She pressed a hand to the glass, sensing the echo of millions of lives caught between conflict and compassion. A curator noticed her lingering there. "Did you live through that?" he asked gently. She nodded. Words trembled on her lips before she spoke. "They saved more than lives," she said. "They saved what fear tried to kill in us." He waited, expecting some grand story. But she offered only a small, sad smile, the kind reserved for moments too private to share. Later that night, at home, she opened the wooden box and unfolded the fragile note again. The paper nearly tore at the creases, yet she held it delicately, remembering the man who had changed her world without meaning to. Outside, the cicadas hummed. Inside, her memories hummed with them alive, persistent, impossibly luminous. She lay back beneath her quilt, feeling the weight of both past and present. And just as sleep pulled her downward, the thought drifted through her mind like a final whispered truth. Sometimes the people who shape our lives are the ones we knew only briefly. The ones who walked into the fire and emerged just long enough to teach us how to hope again. But somewhere, in some quiet corner of her heart, the question remained an echo from a cave on Saipan. A question shaped by fear, but remembered now with grace. What had become of the Marine who once offered her water in a future she could not accept?